Hmm. Yo, wanted to jump in laterally into something I wasn't particularly invited to jump into because, hey, that's just the way I like to roll, the way I like to be. But, was watching a Caruso video and was watching a Divinity video, and Divinity had blocked me from her channel, from her sub list because I made a few comments. I mean, maybe she's observed me in the past and didn't particularly like my style of being or whatnot, but I did make a few comments on one of her videos um, about the one she did to Rocking Mr. E called You're Dismissed with Your Mystery Wannabe Ass. And I made a comment. I said the certainty of colonialism's effect upon indigenous peoples parsing lighter skin from darker skinned children, as this process is or was considered a valuation of their child via a spectrum of superiority or inferiority, is a binary valuation and not a geometric one, as in a star or triangle. Go with me on this. The notion that the parent kept lighter skinned children inside as a coddling response to the notion of superiority seems assumptive. A loving parent would not have their child burnt. Okay, and so I make that comment because in my mind, when I'm watching the video and I'm thinking about my thoughts about the consideration of colors, ethnicities of skin, from my, I don't know, travels in Egypt, from living in LA, from living in New York, travels in the South, my interaction with the Lummi Island Indians, um, the Ute Indians, Cherokee tribes, the different, um, I don't know. I just had a trip down to Louisiana and thinking about the Hispanic culture there seems practically absent compared to the African American black culture down there. And then as you move east, it seems like, well, it's more Cuban. And then as you go west, it seems, more Hispanic, more Mexican. And anyway, so I make that comment on her video because I was trying to point out the concept, first of all, of a binary valuation, good and bad, light skin or lightness, light and delightsome, dark and bad. And I was thinking about the history of the notion of binary function in valuation, and how in my history I remember considering the difference between good and bad and good and evil and then good and wicked. And I thought, what's the difference between wicked and evil? And I had drawn some notion that there was a difference between good and wicked, and that the wick meant coming from the wick, coming from the bush, and that evil was another type of. It was more of a moral behavior, and bad was more or less a distinction of quality, whether or not, depending on what you're trying to do, if something broke, it was bad, or if it didn't succeed, it was bad, in those respects. And so I was basically making, a relationship, good to bad, good to evil, good to wicked, um, and looking at that as a geometry instead of as kind of a necessary binary, that the relationship between bad and evil, or bad and wicked, or wicked and evil, or wicked and good, that these relationships take on a binary or a geometric shape, and geometry has been very, I don't know, interesting to me since going to Egypt, and since thinking about pyramids and shapes and hieroglyphics and the sort. Anyway, and so basically, after watching her video, I said that this is assumptive, that the notion that white people, or the lighter skinned, are necessarily considered good, and hence they're kept indoors, as if now there's a notion that in an interiority is a sign of goodness and an exteriority is a sign of badness. And so that's when I was like, okay, that almost sounds kind of like the notion of a phallus is external, and so it's masculine, where a woman is internalized. And so that's effeminate. And so then I sat there and I thought, well, maybe she's being assumptive about the internality of things, or the notion of maybe kind of wanting to have her grandma be indoors, that a woman's place is in the home, or a woman's internality matches a woman's internal state, and that's best. And then I thought about reading the book Ishmael, and how Ishmael was talking about the notion of Adam and Eve, and the time of the Bible was at a specific separation between when nomadic groups of humanity started to become agricultural groups in humanity, and that the distinction between the nomadic and the agriculture role became the distinction between the good and the wicked, and so that all of a sudden this idea of property ownership and cultivation and staying in one location and protecting a periphery, and then you get the idea of like Cain and Abel, where you get the sheep herder and then you got the ground cultivator. Both of these are agricultural, as opposed to hunter-gatherer, gathering of the vegetation and then hunting for the vegetation, right? So all of these things are kind of ricocheting in my mind while I'm making these comments. And then so her response kind of caught me off guard. She says, I'll tell my grandmother, who went through this herself, of your doubt. I'm sure she won't be surprised. And I thought, okay, my point was, a loving parent would not have their child burned. And what I meant by that was, if I had an albino child and I had another child that wasn't an albino, regardless of their skin tone, I would certainly be protecting the albino child from the sun, right? In in a measurable way, differently than my other child. And so my point is that if there were offspring of any family in maybe an equatorial location hemispherically, that that the fair child would then perhaps need to be more indoors, right? And so, but I'm assuming that her grandma, and the notion of, what people put on their skin to protect themselves from the sun, especially the fairer skin or whiter people might have put on their suntan lotion, right? So I make a comment. I said, oh, was your grandmother one? Oh, well, I respond initially with this. I say, oh, was your grandmother one who inherited the colonial view and decided to parse her children into dark, bad, go to work outside, the lighter good stay coddled inside. Meaning I'm saying, because she's saying that colonialism, the effect of colonialism was that her people now bumping into this new hierarchical power about what was considered binarily, singularly up and down now, which I don't think is an indigenous modality of thinking. And I think that just by being an English speaker, an Indonesian language speaker, as opposed to such as the Piraha or the South American and Middle American tribal languages, which I've argued with Anton and other individuals as having what might be claimed a more primitive or a greater empiricism to their approach, a less socio-historic ability, a less ability to count and so forth, might be something that was not a survival trait for these particular types of tribes to have the type of language that we say is recursive. And so anyway, my point is that bumping into and absorbing language and the hierarchy of language, or even Spanish from Spain, as the colonists, as they are imbued into the southern hemispheric indigenous tribes, what are claimed to be the indigenous people, which are what Eskimo, Native American, come across supposedly from the Bering Strait as Asiatic individuals. So the Asiatic, indigenous, and so forth. And so what I'm saying, though, is that in my mind, there's this already assumptive valuation going on. And she's saying that the effect of colonialism, and I don't know if she means Spanish conquistadors or if she's referring to, white Plymouth Rock. I'm only assuming that because of the Manifest Destiny Concord displacement of the United States American Indians. I'm assuming that's the group she's talking about, not the other colonists, but there are many colonizing. So she's kind of just lumping that all together, right? I'm just trying to hope to flesh this out a little bit, because I find divinity, I found her refreshing in her, really stark approach towards dealing with feminism and sex rights activists. And I just thought, wow, she's a strong woman. And I was going down to Louisiana. I even asked, like, hey, I'd like to meet you, but I got no response from her. And so whatever. Anyway, and so I'm saying in this, because she's saying, once again, that the colonists imported this view, this hierarchy, this mode onto the indigenous people, into their mind, into their culture, such that they now must be dependent upon this new hierarchical structure, right? And in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, when did that happen? Was it somebody before your grandma, or was it your grandma, or was your grandma the effect of that, right? And so that's what I'm saying is who or at what point, and who is to blame of your people, divinity, if you watch this, who is to blame in of the indigenous group? Not, I don't believe that you're purely indigenous. I think you probably have some European in you, and you like to claim things that way because it's important to do so, and you probably are predominantly of the Mexican, Hispanic. You appear that way, and you've claimed that and such, so, and I don't know your origin, don't claim to, but I'm a brown eye, I part got Chickasaw, my mom's dad's mom is Chickasaw. But anyway, but what I'm getting at here is, so she's saying there was this effect of this new hierarchical colonized approach, which might be said to be something of a distinction that's inherited from, let's say, Spain, right, where the Moors are. And if you watch the Guns, Germs, and Steel, and they talk about the traveling of the information, moving west to east from the Asiatics to the Spain, and that information travels that way. And then you have the black people coming up from Africa, and the white individuals moving downward, that there was a nice cross section in Spain of knowledge, and that if that that is the base of the colonization of the Mexican people, hence Spanish, then there's already a certain imbuement of whatever it was that that culture brought over, right? And then that makes me think, to what extent was the idea of the Moors' relationship to Spain, the Nubians' black relationship to the basically the generating or repopulating, moving black and white bloodlines together, that becomes of interest. And then this also has me thinking about the Jews and how you have the darker, I forget the name, but like the Rosh Jews, and then the lighter Jews, or maybe I should be saying Hebrews, from Egypt, were the ones that went over Libya, and they're the darker ones, and then you got the ones that went up over Israel, and that's where they mostly moved to, and that they're two different distinct, notions of, one are darker Jews and the other ones are lighter Jews. But in terms of the valuation, where does this valuation come from? Because she's wanting to flesh that out. But anyway, so back to my comment. What I'm trying to get at in my comment is, so was it your grandma's grandma that first adopted this new hierarchy, or was it your grandma, or was it your grandma's parents? Like who in your tribe, assumed the base of this new hierarchy? And that had me thinking about this discussion that I was having with my friends. My friend Rex, who's married to Rosario. Rosario's Mexican, and they were talking about the work ethic of Mexicans, and how there was a connotation in the word vocation or occupation or employment that meant something almost like to serve the whole, as opposed to manage the whole, or something to that effect, where it was like something about getting a job or getting an occupation or a vocation meant in Spanish a little differently than it meant in English. And so that she said that the approach towards the work ethic of the Mexican population as it comes into the United States is one that wants to serve or serves on the base, right? It's not. It's almost like it's not about privilege as much as it might be about connotation. I mean, there's obviously something to be said about privilege. I'm not trying to scratch that away or downplay that in the slightest. But when I was in LA, I was painting a lot of landscapes and so forth. And I ended up being hired by a guy that was, he was head, it was like, he was like one of the top 20 Hispanic companies in California, Hispanic-run companies, and they're very, very proud of this. And he had echoed something about this pride that had come with being a business owner, a Hispanic business owner, because this was such a greater feat for the Hispanic to take on. And then I thought of my friend Rex, married to Rosario, saying that the connotation of the work itself, the way in which Mexicans look at work, is a little differently, or something like that. Anyway, so I'm just throwing that in as a sideline, right? Okay, and so anyway, back to the comment. So what I'm doing is I was trying in my comment to get divinity to maybe see that at some point there was an accepted hierarchy, either by force, assuming by force, that, if one is made slave or subservient in order to move through that new culture, one must abide by the rules, spoken and unspoken, of that, and hence one is falling prey to a hierarchy. But there was also the notion, from her vantage point, from the paradigm that she seems to be taking on, or what as her relationship is to her grandmother, she seems to already assume that not only is this a cultural effect, but assume that somehow that this was just a ubiquitous thing. So this must have happened at some point, some timeline. One of her people, quote unquote, her people, must have abided by this and then separated and parsed out the lighter child from the darker child, making a distinction between good and bad, or good and evil. That distinction seems like, okay, the darker child's evil, so we're going to put it out in the field, right? Once again, going back to the notion that the nomad, already biblically speaking, is already considered evil compared to those that are agricultural based, right? So she's already inherited from something way back, biblical at times, already has imbued itself, let's say, upon the indigenous people of the Western continents, the Americas. Although this is arguable, because I have no idea, she has no idea, many people have no idea what the structures are of the people, how the cultures existed exactly. It's plenty of speculation, and I'm no archaeologist who study that, or socioanthropologist, and so even speculation on this is beyond me. And even if I heard thesis dissertation from individuals, I'd be skeptical as to their conclusions, as I am with most conclusions and truisms. Anyway, and so basically I was saying, was your grandma the one that started this parsing, or was she the product of her parents? And why assume this idea was sourced from the colonist and not an expression of your people? Right? And so by that, what I was meaning was, let's investigate the idea once again that if it is sourced from her people, and it's not based on the biblical notions of good and bad, good and wicked, or good and evil, and let's say it's also not it doesn't come from the Spanish colonists, right, that could have brought over that notion, this binary separation of utility, right, and that the indigenous people might actually have a less sociohistoric language type, that is a non-recursive type, throughout the Americas originally, right, such that there might be something assumptive. Why assume that they themselves, these people, would not also say, if I had a lighter skinned kid, they get a tan, right, and they go out there, but then they seem, maybe if they are historic, sociohistoric speaking individuals, and they can share this down through elders and of tribe and history and whatnot, that people are the lighter skin are dying, and perhaps that the lighter skin were dying, right? So there is this notion, and so I'm following up then with, where comes this idea that indoors is superior to outdoors? And then I suggest house slave, field slave. Is it that, what Malcolm X and the history of slavery and the relationship between the house slave and the field slave, and that particular dichotomy that was brought up, is that where do you think that might possibly be where you're getting this idea that might come from the slavery historic aspects of America, or do you think it's coming back from the notion, this other idea? Now I speculate. I'll wax over that here and that, and I say, so are you saying that light-skinned children burn equally to darker? Ask your grandma about suntan lotion, right? Now I think she thought that I was being snarky because her response was immediately, my grandma picked cotton in the fields when she was a little girl in the video. And I say this in the video, thanks for your insensitivity, and tell me this, you rude asshole. If my grandmother had to pick cotton because they were poor, how the fuck is she supposed to afford suntan lotion? You know what? Don't answer, just fuck off directly. Whew. And I thought, wow. So I wrote, you misunderstood me entirely. Sigh. Oh well. And then she blocked me from the channel. Could not believe it. I've yet to have, lest Anton, such a complete separation of, like, a huge palimpsest of being misunderstood, where I'm assuming that my vantage point could have possibly been known. But that's why I'm making this video, is partially, in part, because of just this difference that's going on in terms of just consideration. Excuse me. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so anyway, where do I want to go from here with this? Yeah, I wasn't being snarky when I was saying ask your grandma about suntan lotion. I was more like implying your grandma probably did not have modern suntan lotion as we know it, as I knew it as a child. And, like, Indy's roughly my age, and so I'm assuming your grandma is roughly my grandma's age, and that their notion of suntan lotion was a lot different, and it might have been a lot different from wherever grandma was raised, right? But the whole idea was not about the suntan lotion or being insensitive. It was simply a question, like, if you knew something was going to harm your child, would you do it? And so let's say I did have an albino child or a lighter skinned child, and I wanted to bring them indoors. Where cometh the idea that the house child is superior to the field child? And I think that is rooted in the notion of agricultural versus nomadic types of people, and or the notion of the internality of women, the yin versus the yang of the externality of the man. I'm waxing. Okay. Now, another thing I'd like to consider is the mark of Cain, right? If you look up the mark of Cain. Now, I'm in Utah. Utah. And, by the way, these other subsequent videos that, before I go here, that Divinity has made, I watched them. She seems to think that all Native American reservations are the same, right? I'll tell you something, that Detroit, Michigan is worse than a lot of Native American reservations. And a lot of Native American reservations have chieftain or councils that make decisions about the sale and conduct of wires that go across their land, not airspace, but resource management. Granted, the Indian continue still to this day. It's obvious, they got a raw deal, but not all of them are the same, right? The Lummi Islands, the Lummi Indians in Washington, substantially different mode of income and or loss of income compared to when you cross the I want to say it's the Cherokee reservation, but it might be like I'm off, but it's the northern, the one right that's where southeastern Utah meets New Mexico. There's a very healthy, large economy, a very great agricultural center, and there's lots of job placement, and still the ethnicity of the group is still genetically very sound. And it's very vibrant, and you can find other, people have written articles as to why some Indian nations are doing, Indian nations are doing better than others because of their not only contracts but their mode of approach. Everything's not about casinos. Some of it also has to do about just mode of living that's chosen. But anyway, what was I going to go? Oh yeah, Cain and Abel, the mark of Cain. Now, what is the mark of Cain? Right now, I'm in Utah right now. Divinity is very sensitive to Arizona law, and one thing I need to point out, a lot of things that people don't know, is just the power that the LDS, Latter-day Saint, or Mormons have upon Arizona law, Utah law, Idaho law, even California law with Proposition 8. The reason I bring this up is because if you take the Hebraic interpretations or other base Protestant Christianities, and you consider the idea of the sign of Cain, mark Cain, curse of Cain, it's substantially different than the LDS notion of the curse of Cain. The curse of Cain in LDS history is a black and white one. Cain is the mark of Cain, the curse of Cain, is that he has black skin. Right? There's a definite devaluation because he's the murderer. He is scorned as the mark of Cain, and hence that by Mormon theology. And speak about manifest destiny. If you look up Mountain Meadow massacres in Mormonism, if you note even in the top corner now, on often videos now, I don't know if it's due to Romney, I don't know if it's just due to the financial power that Mormons have, but you'll see a lot of Mormon messages, and you'll see a lot of them are with black kids, Afro-American kids, or mixed race couples, and there is this, like, they're really trying to get over their history, right? Even though Joseph Smith ordained a black man into the priesthood, they still considered black skin the mark of Cain, and that these people were considered lesser than and greater than. Now, if you read the Book of Mormon, you'll see that they have the Lamanites, lame, black, Nephites, neat, white, right, that are warring against each other supposedly in the Americas as tribes of Israel, which I think is, according to the Jews and certain historians, just an absurdity. But their book functions as quite a bit of a fantasy, although I find it seductive and compelling in certain respects. But nevertheless, it's separating black and dark skin with curse and negativity. And this brings up to me the very convention of recursive language and hierarchies and the convention within languages, because I think that some hierarchies you can step away from if you're willing to tolerate the violation. But I bring this up, the very notion of a map of the world or a globe. Why is Antarctica, and why is north up, and why is the antithesis of Antarctica, down, south, on the bottom, right? Why is it that the Canadian and the Swedish, Norwegian, the fairest skin, highest, when I say highest, I mean of the convention of the reed of the globe that is considered upward, right? such that if one wanted to travel north, they're also traveling up. I don't know why the convention is that way. I don't know why maps are not flipped over. It's not that, the top of the universe is the North Star. This is completely arbitrary, right? So this is a convention that is just, it by itself is as inherited of a value system as the very dilemma that I think that divinity finds herself struggling with, going, ricocheting her mind through and warring over. I think if she can answer why the convention of the map is putting North on top as opposed to South Africa, Madagascar, or Australia on top. If she can answer that question, she might find an answer to the questions that she shares. I think it's interesting. I may link a link to a painting I did of the notion of my separation, my personal notion between good and wicked, and then a reprisal painting I call the Spectre of Lamanite Appeal, where I am indulging the ruse against the LDS notion of the mark of Cain being bad, where women are considered suppressed, and so I put a black woman as superior, although her skin is blue in the painting. So I made a link those. Anyway, I just wanted to throw this out here because I don't know. I also like Caruth's videos. Uh-oh. Okay, I hope I'm not losing connection here. I better stop. It looks like I might be losing connection. Anyway, so maybe Divinity, if you see this, you can take me off your block list, and let me tell you that I still appreciate you, even if I think that your love of Hannibal Barca is, or your respect is lame. I think he's a bit of a blowhard. He's got a knowledge set of anyone that takes the general survey courses in college, and he just seems to be overly proud of that fact. But yeah, so I'm not certain what else to say other than, yeah, the control of the LDS religion on the north-south, the Idaho-Arizona border, and the right wing, the Republican approach, and the nationalistic approach, right? Whatever it is that we want to call a constitutional America, and the Republic as the LDS lockstep in relationship to that. I'm a constitutionalist. I think that immigration law is very, very important, although I'm not certain to what extent there's bias going on in the law in Arizona in terms of stereotyping and I tell you, my friend's marriage to his wife and his daughter, she's native Mexican and having to get her visa, they are having so many loopholes to jump through. It's just absolutely maddening. So there is a lot of stress that goes on with nationalism, constitutionalism, with ideology that's inherited not just with Christian ideology, but things that I think could go back. You could even trace them back, if not to pre-colonialism, Spanish colonialism in the Mayan culture. I'm not certain to what extent you'd speak about racism. But one, you might also want to wax over the idea of the fair-skinned Japanese, the geisha girl, the history of white makeups and clowns. You might want to consider the pharaohs, the black pharaohs, the lighter pharaohs, Queen Hatshepsut, the feminine pharaoh dressed as man. You might want to consider the migrational patterns, the placement of Israel right outside of Egypt, the Arabic mixtures, the ethnic mixtures, their relationship to the Sudanese, Nubians, and their conflict on the northern end of Africa as opposed to the southern, you know, the English and the native South African conflicts that are going on there as perhaps indicators of what's going on. This notion of getting along. Can't we all get along? This notion of common sense is, I think that's the modern notion. I think it's a myth. We share language, you know, but as we homogenize the world, we lose the biodiversity, and we do lose, if we all speak the same language, we'll lose the distinctions of connotation, intonation, and different modalities of living that come from the speaking of another type of language. So it's a real pity, I think. But so in as much divinity is, I don't know what your reflection on this video might be, but in as much as you are an English speaker, you already are fulfilling the value distributions or value concepts that perhaps a strictly Spanish-speaking ancestry of your own and their ancestry, a pre-Spanish-speaking ancestry, at least down that portion of your lineage, or of my own lineage in that respect, have a whole different mode of living, a substantially different way of living that to compare historically and try to find justice through history to the present, and then trying to find present justice and present commonality and war for this commonality as it relates to agreement, as agreement relates to truth, as you quest for truth upon agreement, wanting there to be something that you can cardinally grab onto and say is true, and is the case, and has always been the case for all people in all time. I guess to some extent, I think that itself is not actual, factual, real. In other words, I don't believe necessarily in the cardinality, the determinacy of truth, less just the logical statement of truth. Hence, the denial of the statement would contradict it. But anyway, I'm just going here there. Okay, so hopefully that's over and out. Oh, and by the way, there's my green man. Yahoo! Go Rodney, the gun-slamming hermit clown. Okay, cheers from one brown eye to another.